Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Madison's Notes, the official podcast of Princeton University's James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions. I'm your host, Laura Laurent, and today's guest is a trained historian with a deep expertise in the U.S. South and the Atlantic world, here to discuss his recent publication, Religion and Republic, Dr. Miles Smith. He completed his undergraduate studies at the College of Charleston in South Carolina and earned his PhD from Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas. His primary research focuses on intellectual history, covering ideas, religion, slavery, and freedom, though he occasionally dives into political history as well. In addition to his academic work, he edits 19th century historical theology and is currently revising a religious biography of Andrew Jackson. His recent book, Religion and Republic, is the topic of our conversation today, where we explore the intersection of religion and republicanism in the American founding during the 19th century. Smith examines how religious beliefs, particularly Protestantism, shaped Southern political and social thought, influencing ideas of governance, liberty, and community. The book dives into how religion both justified and challenged prevailing structures like slavery, and how it played a crucial role in the religion's identity before the Civil War. Thank you for joining me in welcoming Dr. Miles Smith to the show. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for coming onto the show today.
Thanks for having me, Laura. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation on your recent publication, Religion and Republic. Just for our listeners, though, can you give us a brief overview of what was the inspiration for this book, and who do you most hope that it's going to be read by?
Yeah, so I think I was, I don't know if inspired is the right word. Maybe annoyed is a better word. I was sort of taken aback at the way that conversations on the right were developing about political theology. You have the rise of so-called integralism, typically on the Catholic side, and a bit more Protestant-coded Christian nationalism. And so the conversations seemed to be pretty confused, and I didn't think it was very helpful. We live in a time where the limits of religion and politics and their interactions are being debated quite a bit. Times are changing. And it seemed to me that the conversation that was happening was sort of a very confused one, where people were sometimes trying to do religion with politics and trying to do politics as religion. And so what I wanted to do is sort of cut through the chaff and say, okay, how have at least Protestants understood this? Catholic intellectuals tend to have a better taxonomy of what is churchly and what is not. And so then they've taken the institution of the church more seriously. And so I wanted to sort of push Protestants to not necessarily be Catholic, but to at least have some sense of their churches as institutions, and other institutions where Christianity was sort of outletted. Obviously, there's a capacious place in the American political order for religious schools, religious charities. And so to take institutions seriously and sort of understand that you don't have to have the church do politics in order to be a Christian and interact in the political order. And so I wanted to sort of go back to at least the United States' history and see how that had been done in the 19th century, because I think in some ways it was actually almost healthier. Then there was a better understanding of what was churchly, what was political, and the terms of religion were understood almost in a healthier way. And so if anything, it's just a get to sort of nudge Protestants, and not just Protestants. I think Catholics could find it helpful too, but to nudge Protestants to take institutions seriously. And to sort of understand that politics doesn't need to be immediately nationalized, that there's other political institutions, intermediary things like not just the family, but obviously schools, charities, you name it, that are worth prioritizing as political actors. Obviously, we have reduced politics merely almost down to presidential elections. Mm-hmm. It's much more than that, right? Like our political lives can be something as mundane as the lives we live in association with the schools we interact with, the charities we interact with, our churches.
Interesting. And I'm curious, this is especially important in considering church and state, which is a really big topic these days, but has always been a big topic, which I appreciated about your book to get also just a different perspective on the integral relationship between Protestantism and the American founding and how those two interplayed or were sometimes even synonymous. And I'm curious, when we're speaking about church and state, there's always this conversation of secularism. And I'd like to ask you, how would you define secularism, particularly in the American founding and during the time period that you're really looking at in this text? And does the definition that you're using in this text for the late 1700s, early 1800s, is it the same way you would define secularism today?
That's a really good question. I sort of, wanted to at least push back on the presentation that the United States is founded as a secular republic. As we understand the word secular, historically, the word secular has typically meant just not churchly. And so one of my kind of little, funny ways of talking about this book is I tell people I'm not doing a book on church and state. I'm doing a book on religion and the Republican order. And that sounds like a juke, but it's actually important because I think there's a space, obviously, the historic understanding from the medievals, the early moderns, and right to the modern era, is that which is secular is that which is not churchly. So it's that which isn't immediately under clerical control, and so obviously there are schools, for example, are something that are seen as secular in the early American Republic. Primary schools, many of them state-funded primary schools, especially in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states, those schools are understood to be secular, meaning they're not churchly, they're not controlled by any sort of clerical institution or ecclesiastical institution. Nonetheless, they were completely Christian in their civilizational and social and even intellectual commitments, right? You think of something like the primers that get used, and the primers are wedded to oftentimes not merely Christian, but also explicitly sort of Congregationalist Calvinist reading of soteriology, of kind of the religious order. So these are state schools that are also religious schools, but they're secular because they're not churchly. They're not controlled by a church. And so in the early republic, that understanding of secular was more common. For us, when we say secular, we mean something that is entirely irreligious. So secular for us is a synonym with irreligiosity instead of saying something's not churchly. So we've lost this kind of middle, if I'll call it a middle space between that which is there's irreligion, and then there's the secular, and then there's that which is religion.
I'm curious, as far as the way that the founders or people were thinking about secularism is very interesting to me, and I want to push on it from a modern perspective. Yeah. If something is entirely made up of religious ideas, of religious values, and people operating the system, even if there's not a person at the top saying this is going to be religious, does that still, or I should say, it almost seems like secularism is still sneaking the religion in.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, can you expand on that in regards to how it interplays going forward?
Yeah, so I think that for the founding generation, what I'll call the founders, the guys who are sort of shaping the Constitution, and the statesmen who are sort of living and working in the early republic, for them, they really see the idea of a disestablished state. So there is no state religion in the federal government. That doesn't mean that they're indifferent to religion or that they think they're perpetuating an irreligious order. So what it means is that that there's a specific type of protection that's given to religion by secular government. And so that protection extends not merely to Protestants. It might be read downstream from a Protestant political creation, but it doesn't mean that protection, that's the creation of this Protestant order, is only extended to Protestants. So, for example, it will eventually extend to Roman Catholics and Jews, and in our own time, that sort of extension is going to other faiths. You see Islam, Hindu schools, Buddhist schools, et cetera, et cetera. So what it means is that, look, there's this kind of specific protection to religion as religion that's offered by the U.S. Constitution. And so it's one of the reasons why there's tension is because a lot of people in the era said, well, do we need to stay Protestant in order to have Protestantism be protected? And the answer they come up with is no, you don't need a Protestant state to protect a Protestant educational or cultural or civilizational order. That the Constitution guarantees that without having to go back and sort of sacralize the state, the same way that John Hughes, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of New York, will eventually say, no, that we live under a good government. This is a government that treats Catholics well. Why? Well, because it's protecting our right to religion. It's protecting our ability to practice our religion. We don't need a Catholic state. We don't need a Catholic theocracy in order to have a healthy Catholic order. John Hughes is one of the best Catholic voices in understanding that. So I work him into the book, and very purposely because they're understanding that look, the state of New York in his case is a pretty healthy place for Catholics in the 1850s. Obviously, you have nativist upheavals, but for the most part, it's actually pretty peaceable. More so than even in places in Europe, where you actually have to have a sacralized state or some sort of state religion in order to guarantee that sort of protection.
Mm-hmm. I see. And I think this is a good moment to touch into the disestablishment character of this time period and contrasting it with perhaps how our modern culture has disestablishment tendencies as well, but of a different flavor.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on the differences that we are seeing, or what the older version of disestablishment character meant and what it continued to uphold, if anything?
That's a great question. I think so. Disestablishment in the early republic doesn't mean removing religious institutions from the civil or even the political spheres. So no one thinks, for example, that there's a question over, say, whether chaplains should exist, or even whether clergymen can serve as state officers, for example. So that's not a debate. For them, disestablishment just means the state will not give money or legal privilege to a specific church. That's what disestablishment means in the early republic. What we tend to think it means is that churches and any sort of religious institutions can't actually have a specific type of civil or political standing. So we basically sort of have removed religion, not merely churches, but the idea of religious institutions in general from the civil and political order. So we actually have sort of created disestablishment for us means sort of a space where religion can't even get to, a sort of completely irreligious politics, a completely irreligious civil order.
Mm.
And that's really a creation of the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century, much more so than it is the founders' understanding and the early republic's understanding of disestablishment,
Mm-hmm.
which was that no, religion has institutional standing in the civic realm and in politics. And that to a degree that would make a lot of people in the United States in our own time uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to have a little bit more of this perspective, especially when diving into later in the conversation, words like disestablishment and secularism, and having just that different understanding of the context that these words are coming from, because it's easy to assume our context into there. So thank you for those good answers.
You're very welcome.
And as far as going back to a little bit more of the content of the book, you describe a number of ways in which Protestantism was somewhat baked in to the civil and social order of the time. And I wanted to touch on specifically legislation as the United States is starting to expand. You use Ohio as a large example. Can you tell us more about how Protestantism was connected to the legislative aspects of the expanding United States of America?
So each of these states, when they're drawing up a constitution, Ohio's the first sort of trans-Appalachian state above the Ohio River. So it's going to be represented for a lot of what we might call the northern states. Kentucky and then Tennessee are both states that are west of the Appalachian Mountains, but they're both below the Mason-Dixon line. What Ohio does is really interesting is that they preserve a lot of the sort of civic establishments of Christianity in their constitution that their settlers received from, say, Congregationalist New England or Anglican Virginia. So they're not creating a sort of civic carte blanche, right? There's not a sort of new order that's totally denuded of even what we might call establishmentarian structures. No, there's no state church like there was in Virginia in the 1780s, or like there is in parts of New England up until the 1830s. But nonetheless, they're keeping sort of the civic and political and legal frameworks that are built around Protestant Christianity in their new constitution. And so they're not sort of wiping out, they're not starting over. They're taking a lot of these things that they got from the colonial era and taking them and putting them, or what might be better to say, leaving them in the Constitution of Ohio. So even as they create these new state constitutions, they're not overthrowing the civic and social order built on Protestant Christianity that they had received from wherever they're coming from. Bernard Balin makes this point in his books that, look, no one's trying to redo the social order, and in as much as religion's a social institution, no one's trying to sort of remove it from its place or even revolutionize its place. So you see this in Ohio and Indiana, Michigan to a lesser extent, Illinois, Wisconsin. All of these states sort of retain Christianity's institutional place in their civic and political structures.
Can you give an example or a few examples
Yeah.
of what that looks like? Because it's one thing to say, oh, they're maintaining
Yeah.
the structure, but like, what is that structure made up of? Or because not all of our listeners are familiar with Protestant systems
It's a
of
good question.
organization.
One of the big things is Sabbath laws. So sort of laws that are built to regulate certain activities on Sundays. Almost every state has some sort of Sabbath law. Another place is that there's not stipulations on citizenship in a lot of these states. So you can be whatever religion you want and be a citizen, but to hold certain offices, you would have to attest to, say, the truth of the Christian scriptures or something like that. North Carolina retains one of these provisions. I mean, state governments aren't very big, so they're really just the state legislatures, the governors, and the few institutions that the state runs. And so one of the most prominent institutions that a state ran in the early republic, the sort of the crown jewels of state governments in a lot of ways, were their state universities, state colleges. And so what you see there is really fascinating in Indiana and in Michigan, in South Carolina. So it's both North and South. It's not sort of geographically coded. They would basically build in Christian intellectual precepts into a state-sustained university. So, for example, one of the positions you'll see in Indiana, Michigan, South Carolina is a professor of the evidences of Christianity. So the state is paying someone to essentially do Christian apologetics because they think this is a net benefit to their societies, and they think that to have a rightly ordered politics, their potential legislators who are being educated in state universities need to understand particular precepts of the Christian religion. This won't be limited merely to Protestants. It's usually Protestants because that's just who happens to form the majority of the country before 1850 or so.
I'm curious, why did Protestants not feel the need to establish an actual state church? Like, they were obviously in a position to do so. Like, why didn't they take that opportunity at the time to just like make it official?
They need it. Yeah, it's a great question. They just don't think they need a state church. They really don't think they need that. They don't think that a Protestant civil order or even a Protestant social order needs a state church to work.
In part because the majority of citizens were just so Protestant, they were like, well, this is what we are, so we don't need to say it because it already exists.
A state church would have meant sort of obliterating some of the unity that they thought their society had, because, okay, whose state church is it going to be? No one wants to get into that. So they actually think the state being out of churches is really important. They're not so convinced that the republic needs to be left out of religion. They think the republic protects religion. But when it comes to the actual states and churches, or even the federal government and a state church, they are committed to keeping that very separate. So separation for them is really about the particular institution of the church, of
Hmm.
the ecclesiastical kind of institution that is the church, something that can do sacraments and can bind consciences. They want the state to be as far away from that as possible. When it comes to actual religious expression, religious commitments, they want the republic to interact with that pretty regularly and fruitfully.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting given the history of Protestantism, in that it's not like the Catholic Church where they're like, and authority was handed down one to the next. So I can see that it almost the avoidance of the topic of like, okay, well then who's in charge allows them to maintain that sense of unity without having to submit to some
Yeah.
sort of authoritarian or authoritative
And they think it
person.
keeps their churches pure. This is what's interesting. The
Mm,
Protestants think it basically keeps their churches from being sort of unduly influenced by the political order. So they actually can give a pure ecclesiastical structure to the people. Why? Because we know it's not messing with politics. It's not being mucked with by statesmen. That we are giving you now, if you're an Episcopalian, you're getting the pure, like the pure Episcopal order. Uh, and if you're a Presbyterian, you're getting pure Presbyterian government, pure Baptist. So they actually think that separation allows for, it's sort of paradoxical. They actually think it gives a pure understanding of ecclesiology and a pure ecclesiology to successive generations. Why? Because they can go back and say, see, this hasn't been mucked with by government. This is the true, pure church that you're getting. So
mm,
it's somewhat paradoxical, and they think it's actually not, they actually wouldn't have thought it's sort of ignoring ecclesiology. They would have thought it's preserving
mm,
ecclesiology in its
mhm.
purest form.
That's so interesting because it seems almost as there's potentially a large group of people. I'm not sure to call them on the left, not necessarily, but there's a large sentiment building that it's almost the opposite now,
Right.
in that church mucks with politics.
Mm-hmm.
So that perspective is just very interesting, and I want to dive into that, but we've got
Yeah.
other places to go. So, um, parts of one of the chapters in your book is oriented towards the global perception of Protestantism as or at the United States as a Protestant nation as it was seen internationally. Thoroughly, you talk a lot about John Quincy Adams and his
Mm.
representation of the United States, and you talk about this ambassador Poinsett and his time
Yeah.
in Mexico. And while he was there, he was checking out the implementation of the Catholic social order onto Mexico when he was there, and the differences that he was starting to see between the American, like Protestant technique, or technique or strategy, versus what he was seeing in the Catholic realm in Mexico. And I would love for you to just give us a
Yeah.
little bit more background, but then also note what those differences were at that time period that Poinsett was really getting into.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you've asked this. This is one of my next book projects. It's going to deal with this a little bit more. Joel Poinsett was an Episcopal, one of these Charlestonian sort of Episcopalians, and his family's Huguenot. That's his ancestry, Poinsett. By the way, the flower, the poinsettia, we get from him. He went down and brought a bunch of them back, and so
Oh, that's
yeah.
interesting.
So the poinsettia is, he went to Mexico and brought a certain type of Mexican flower back. Um, Poinsett is a bit unusual because he's pretty convinced that Mexico is a near theocratic Catholic order. I wish I could have had more time to dive into this. And he sort of makes all these complaints. What's funny though is he's pretty sure Mexico needs to adopt specific types of liberal political structures that are absolutely creations of English Protestantism. So he basically says, the problem with them is they're theocrats. And what they really should do is adopt politics that happen to come specifically from English Protestantism. So he wouldn't have said that. He can't admit that.
Mm,
But even the idea of transmitting what we call liberalism into Mexico, there were two Masonic lodges that kind of uh, warded out. One was the York Rite Lodge and one was the Scottish Rite Lodge, and both the conservatives. It's funny how Mexico is very Catholic, but there was still a lot of Masonic activity in Mexico at the time, and so these respective lodges are kind of homes for people with different political beliefs. And so he basically is always going to the lodge that has all all what we would call sort of American style constitutionalists, what they called liberals, and he's pretty convinced that America is at once sort of anti-theocratic, but he's acting like it's Protestant. It's acting like, well, to be a good liberal, of course you have to be Protestant, and so he's sort of taking he's sort of taking that line. So there's kind of whispers there of a specific reading of the relationship between American politics and religion that isn't even, and again, I couldn't go into this, but it's something worth mentioning. It's not even shared by most of the people in South Carolina, his home state.
Mm.
South Carolina is a bit of an odd duck as the early republic goes. There's a group of South Carolinians who write to Pope Gregory the 16th and they say, hey, we really respect what you're doing over there. You're pushing against all this modernity. We're not even Catholic, but keep it up, bro, sort of thing. So yeah, Poinsett is, he is an ambassador who is a good American, but who hasn't really thought through sort of his reflexes. I mean, he is what he would say is anti-theocratic, anti-monarchical, and so his reflexes are just a sort of proto-liberal American liberalism, which is more religiously coded, I think, than even American liberals would want to admit. A lot of what we call liberalism is downstream from a specific understanding that of politics that comes from English Puritans, and so sort of like there's a reason why sort of Massachusetts liberals today are liberal like they are, and it's because, well, that was kind of like Congregationalist central. So right, there's some lines there that somebody's going to tease out, but I think you can see a little bit of the seeds of things with Poinsett. So yeah, stay tuned. More on that for the next book project. So
Oh, can't wait. Well, and it makes me interested to know, because Poinsett seemed to have his own perspective that one had to be a Protestant in order to be a liberal. Almost,
Mhm.
they were synonymous, or necessary to yeah. If you had one, you had to have the other. But I'm curious, as far as other thinkers during this time, did they really give consideration to individuals who weren't going to be Protestant and how that would interact with the system that they were putting up? And of course, there were Catholics, and I'm curious
Right.
how they engaged, but did they even have the creativity or the ability to foresee, Islam or any other large religions coming in and interacting in these systems?
Yeah, my colleague Daryl Hart, DG Hart, has a biography of Benjamin Franklin that I think teases this out a little bit. Franklin actually has a pretty capacious sort of space in his mind for other religions sort of interacting in what's still at least a largely Protestant order. I think that for so many of the figures of the early republic, they don't see something like Islam being something practiced en masse. They do see Catholicism being practiced en masse, and there's a tension there. Some of them are like, it's no problem. Some of them think it's a big deal, um, and sort of so they don't see the idea of, say, en masse Hindu or en masse Islamic immigration, probably because they don't see en masse immigration
Yeah.
like we understand. So it's hard to know exactly where they would have gone with that, but they're thinking in largely Christian terms, even when they say we're not doing state churches. We're not doing state churches because we have sort of a plurality of Christian sects here, and we want to keep the peace. So even secularism is a largely Christian construction for them.
Mm. All right. I want to shift gears, but we'll come back. There's a thought there that I'll come back
Okay.
to towards the end, if we can. But in another one of your chapters, you talk about the relationship of Native Americans and Protestants, and specifically Protestant missionaries, which also makes it also makes an appearance in your conversation as far as the global impression of the United States.
Yeah.
You had a statement, you said there was an alliance between missionaries, Native Americans, and the Supreme Court, which was unsuccessfully fought against state governments looking to dispossess Native Americans from their rightful lands. And I had never heard that before. Can you please tell me more about this relationship and some of the interplay that was going on, and specifically what about the Protestant missionaries? What was their goal in relationship with Native Americans?
Yeah, a great book to kind of nod to this is Colin Calloway has a book, George Washington's Indian World, and it's sort of about the development of it's sort of the origins of federal policy towards Indians being developed. And one of the things you see right off the bat is the federal government has I'm using this word relatively. It's relatively benign. Obviously, the federal government of the United States is an imperfect human government that does all sorts of bad things. So I don't want to sort of say it's the sparkling example of human morality, but the federal government is not actively dispossessing Native American groups of their land. State governments certainly are to some extent, especially in the South, Georgia being the most obvious example. But the reason why that relationship between the Supreme Court and missionaries and the Indians is important is so as missionaries would go down, typically from the northern states, settle in Indian locales, and the expectation that they have is they're going to be protected as American citizens doing things that the Constitution protects in, say, the state of Georgia. So this is Worcester v. Georgia is the famous case that's associated with the Trail of Tears. Samuel Worcester is a missionary who's going down there, who's convinced that the federal Constitution protects me being a missionary and being here and interacting with these people, over and against the state government, which says, no, you can't be here because this is land that we're taking. And so the federal government's protection of your missionary effort is not significant enough for us to remove you. And so what you have is the Supreme Court sides with Samuel Worcester and vis-a-vis federal protection over and against state laws, attempting to dispossess not merely the Cherokees of their land, but dispossessing missionaries from their rights to do mission work in Georgia, because the state of Georgia identifies this missionary work as seditious, whereas the federal government views it as protected. And so you have sort of a breakdown there that's very interesting. And so the Supreme Court is not the most democratic organization for a reason.
The age-old power dynamic between state and Fed coming in more seriously. I'm curious, what would be some more resources one could find in understanding this relationship between early Protestants and Native Americans, as that's a specific, that's a conversation that I don't think just the right is interested in. Obviously, there's a lot of people on the left where this is a very important, and this is a very important topic right now. So where else could we find information about this history?
A lovely little book by Daniel Blake Smith. I think it's called American Betrayal. It's meant to be read for sort of the interested lay people and non-specialist scholars. It's there's obviously a ton of books on the Trail of Tears, and so usually Worcester v. Georgia is kind of captured in Trail of Tears. Probably one of the best books on that is John Ely's Trail of Tears. Again, John Ely is not a scholar per se, but he's sort of a North Carolinian cooked in. His book, The Trail of Tears, is the one that's still in print. I think that just sort of seeing that moment for what it is. I mean, it's Andrew Jackson sort of and the state of Georgia, which aren't necessarily on the same side, by the way. I think we tend to associate Jackson with the state of Georgia. Jackson's really enemy is the Supreme Court. Georgia's enemy is the Supreme Court. The allies of both the Indians and the missionaries of the Supreme Court. So we sort of have created a binary where it's actually sort of a little bit more complicated. Jackson's not necessarily enthused about a state having that much power, but he sort of lets it slide because it's part and parcel of his sort of duking it out with the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we got some Venn diagrams going on.
Yeah, that's...
As far as the actual interactions between Protestant missionaries and indigenous peoples, I'm curious, was the main, I mean, obviously mission work, but I'm curious about the character of mission work when it came to Protestants, because that's something that often gets critiqued,
Yeah.
is that early Protestantism was so outward focused. Yeah, give us some more insight into what mission work looked like in these early Protestants.
It's committed to not merely what we might call spiritual work, but it's civilizational. They think they're bringing civilization, Christianity with them, and that Christianity in which they think is also synonymous with liberal civilization, small L liberal, small d democratic, sort of American style civilization. So that's happening. What's interesting though, it's probably received a bit better in this era than it will be, say, in the Gilded Age. And part of that's because the government has a softer hand on it. The government's sort of paying missionaries to do its work rather than missionaries sort of being a part of the government. So I think the Gilded Age, what we sort of see is um, the Western chronology after the Civil War is much more missionaries being sort of de facto agents of the government. Government has a policy, and therefore missionaries are doing that policy. What you might view is before the Civil War, the government sort of says, okay, missionaries, we're going to give you the right to do whatever policy you think, and that's going to be our policy. So missionaries are sort of leading on this. I think so. What's interesting is the government sort of following the lead of the missionaries, and in the era afterwards, missionaries are following the lead of the government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also, I could see pre-post Trail of
Mm-hmm.
Tears, and as the expansion of America is continuing west and the types of lands that are available, all of those start to interplay with the level of harm that comes out of a lot of these relationships.
Yeah, and the government's much more heavy-handed
Mm-hmm.
in the Gilded Age than it is the federal government is much more heavy-handed.
Bringing us closer to today, given this context of the Protestant backing of the American founding in this time period before the Civil War, what is the main shift that the Civil War does to this status quo? How does the Civil War affect this culture going forward?
I think it changes how the federal government interacts with religion in some specific ways. You have the federal government is just, I won't say heavier handed, but it's more firmly has its hand more firmly on everything. And so federal power is now meant to sort of be unitive. And obviously, this is where you have the creation of nationalism as we understand it. I mean, a lot of historians, Lincoln historians, Mark Neely at Penn State, for a long time basically said, look, there's this essential nationalism that's created out of the Civil War. And so what it means is that the nation becomes sort of a primary driver of things in a way that that wasn't the case beforehand. Churches sort of interacted without this sort of nationalist paradigm on them in the early republic. So there's sort of a freedom of action, for better or worse, that existed for religion and religious actors before the Civil War. Afterwards, it's not that churches go away, but everything's done much more in the service of the nation. Jackson Lears, who's a professor at Rutgers for a long time, wrote his well-received Rebirth of a Nation, where he sort of says, look, like in the aftermath of the Civil War, you have this kind of admittedly white Protestant militarist nation still, but that white Protestant militarist nation is much more kind of wedded to the apparatus of the federal state. And so what's happening is the federal state takes the lead on stuff, whereas in the early republic, it was almost sort of outsourcing governance to other non-federal state institutions. So the national government is doing more in the aftermath of the Civil War than it was doing in the early republic, and that has some pretty profound effects on the relationship between religion and government, religion, the civil order, etc.
No, I can see how an increase in federal power during a time of war, particularly a war about unifying the nation, would then change the power dynamics going forward in regards to this topic. Because before, as we were speaking about in, say, Ohio or other state constitutions, the formations of these states were having their own conversations about this, and then for the conversation to become a much larger piece of the of the group. So that makes sense. So towards the end of the book, you encourage Protestants today to take a second look into structures and systems that you say have been emphasized too strongly on individualism. And I'm curious, what is the story behind that? And
Yeah.
when you say, and you talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but can you say more about what your encouragement or your charge is at the end of this book?
Yeah. So I think of, when I was in high school, I went to private school, and we had I can't remember if we had a school dance or something at a local Knights of Columbus chapter. And my school wasn't a Catholic school, but we had Catholic faculty. And so the little Knights Hall, and you have it there. And so like something like that the Knights of Columbus aren't a church, right? But they're a explicitly religious institution that does work in the civic life of their community, in the political life of their community, right? If there's something going on, you can have a meeting about, say, a pressing issue in the community at the Knights Hall or something like that. I think that Protestants have kind of forgotten to do that a little bit. And so in the early Republic, you have a lot of these. There would be a Presbyterian auxiliary whatever committee, or a Baptist auxiliary, or Episcopal whatever, and we've kind of forgotten to do those intermediate institutions. Schools are a good example. Hospitals. My cousins were all born at Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte. I think Protestants have kind of forgotten to do institutions. Obviously, there's Catholics have, I think maybe they're a little bit behind. There's obviously loss of Catholic institutions today, which is a cause of concern, but they've been a little bit better at retaining that kind of institutional commitment. And they retain a commitment to the church and religious institutions that aren't immediately churchly, but have these kind of religious commitments. Catholic high schools, Catholic hospitals, the Knights. And so I think the sort of individualistic bent that came probably in the 20th century, sort of Protestants sort of drank a bit too deeply from that, and they've sort of forgotten how to do institutions. And so I think what my admonition is obviously that the sort of the primary institutions, I think, in the life of many Protestants there's the nation, the church, and me. And so my relationship with each of those is heavily individualistic. And so, right, I've got to go out and save the country. Well, how do I do that? Well, I vote for president, and you have your one-on-one relationship with church. And so I think it's just a call for Protestants to think seriously about institutions again, which is maybe I'm sort of shouting into the wind, but I think it's important. And I think slowly but surely, I think at least among conservative spaces, you're seeing people take institutions a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting because oftentimes the conversation is sometimes from the right to the left. Oh, we're losing social institutions, and people who don't go to church are losing out on so much of, X, Y, or Z. But that just because one might go to church or attend participate religiously doesn't necessarily mean that they're obtaining the full communal benefits of what it means to live in community and
Right.
in civil life.
Yeah, and I think that prioritizing that is a way that we can kind of stay connected, and it is something that I think is valuable. We live in a time of polarization and whatnot, so I think it's valuable just to sort of stay connected. It doesn't mean that you're going to cease to be a conservative or cease to be a progressive, but it does mean you might interact with your sort of community in a way to sort of mitigate the sort of immediate need to individually do something that you feel like you have so much pressure about. So
I'm curious, what is the value of pursuing actions that are geared towards institutions versus what we've seen more recently, which is actions geared towards the remaking of a Christian nationalism? Why should we invest in one over the other?
Well, I think that what institutions do is they actually kind of stabilize the political order. And I think a lot of what we have today is because the institutions are failing, and so people are sort of searching for something to give them either stability or something to give them kind of a political kind of foundation. And by political, I don't mean partisan. I mean just like kind of the day-to-day building blocks of the political life that is human association. And so I think that the loss of too many institutions means you end up having a loss of trust in society, which is pretty worrisome. Low trust societies aren't ones you want to be a part of. They don't function really well. And low trust societies have to be governed by autocrats because that's the only person who's sort of able to sort of force everybody to do their will. No, a high trust society, you don't really need that from above sort of power enforcing uniformity and stable socialization. So I think that that's why it's important. You don't want people doubting institutions too much. You want to shore up institutions.
I'm curious for our listeners who are not Protestant, maybe they're a different denomination of Christianity or not Christian at all. What does the history that you provide in your book mean for them and mean for us writ large, looking at the relationship between religion and politics, or religion and republic in today's environment?
I think what it means is, we've built, I think, in throughout the story of America, there's been this kind of edifice of I'll call it liberty that's been built. And um, it's almost like more like a Jenga tower than a pyramid. And so, yeah, I kind of have to very carefully stack these things. And so I think a lot of people say, well, why should I care about Protestantism? I'm a Catholic, or maybe I'm not a religious person, or maybe I'm a Muslim, or maybe I'm a practicing Jew. I think you should care about Protestantism in this regard. There was a specific type of Protestant understanding of liberty that was one of the building blocks that helped us create this sort of Jenga tower. And you need to kind of remember that one because it's really hard to pull those things out and have that kind of edifice of liberty that as we've had it sort of exist for a long time, not collapse. And maybe you can pull it out. You know how you play a Jenga game? Maybe you can pull it out. You just don't really want to necessarily do that. Doesn't mean there's not other blocks that are on that Jenga tower, right? We are thankful and we need the contributions of Roman Catholics and Jews, and now perhaps Hindus and Muslims to kind of the body politic. But you wouldn't want to remove at least this one tradition that gave a certain reading of liberty that we know today. So you shouldn't want to necessarily mess around too much and sort of act like it's sort of indifferent over whether we have that understanding or not. So it doesn't mean that that's the only thing. I think I say in there, like, this Protestant order would never be, it would actually eventually be more than Protestant, but it would never be anything less than. So there will be more blocks added to this, but you probably don't want to have anything less than. You don't want to yank that little Jenga block that was sort of an essential part of the formation of the American sort of order of liberty, empire of liberty, as it's called.
All right. So here's a bonus question for you. That comes, and you don't have to. I'm not. If this isn't quite your specialty, that's fine. And I've already asked you a lot of more interpretive,
No, that's okay.
questions that aren't based on your position as a historian. But what would you say is the virtuous balance between observing the blocks and seeing what they are and seeing how the structure was held up, but then also recognizing where the blocks maybe didn't get put on so well, or they're actually not very supportive of the structure, or whatever, like what for you, and given your context as a historian, is your view of the virtuous balance between appreciation and understanding and critique and moving forward?
Yeah, so I think it's understanding that obviously things are done in time and in space in an imperfect way. If a society is durable, and if it leads to a relatively, like, obviously sort of Christians have a conception of natural law. If it's kind of upholding that kind of natural order and natural law, then it's probably not something you need to add too much onto, and probably something you don't want to take too much off of. If it's working, right, you don't mess with something that's broke. So if something's really wrong, that's when I think you start thinking about maybe we need to move some blocks around here. I think our tendency in the late 20th century, early 21st century has been to maybe mess around with things when something wasn't really wrong. And so now we have now we may have a problem because we sort of tried to escape history's rules a little bit. And so if there's not a big problem, I don't think we should mess with stuff. We may have more problems now than we did when I was in high school or college, perhaps because we messed with stuff, but time will tell.
Well, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for coming on today to Madison's Notes to talk about your recent book, Religion and Republic. This was a very enjoyable conversation. Dr. Smith, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Laura. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes. You can find Dr. Smith's book, Religion and Republic, wherever books are sold, and make sure to check out the comments for any additional resources. As always, send this episode to a friend or foe, and let us know what you think in the comments or on social media. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.